There we go. All right, this morning I want to start with, if I were a Jew, let's go back nearly 2,000 years and let's go to the edge of the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD when the city is being destroyed. The temple is burned, over 1 million people die, and 95,000 of my countrymen are taken away as slaves. And if I were an Orthodox Jew, and if I kept the Passover, and I believed the prophets that the Messiah was to come, what would I think of Christ? And if I were a Jew, knowing that my city, Jerusalem, was destroyed, the temple burned, and that there is no more sacrifice in the temple, and if I were a Jew, even a rabbi that understood the prophets, what would I think of Christ when I realized these 7 things? Let's go to the next slide. When we look at the subject, if I were a Jew, and we're going to look at the following events, they knew and they understood the prophets, and there are 7 things that had to be fulfilled before the Messiah would come. And when I stand upon the edge of the city and I'm watching it burn, I realize that those 7 prophecies could not be fulfilled now because of the temple is gone and the people are gone, the nation is gone. And so 7 things have got to be fulfilled from the perspective of the prophets, and if I were a Jew, knowing the prophets. The next slide will tell us, as we look at these different things, we have the city of Jerusalem now being burned, being a 5.5-month siege by Titus, and they destroyed the city. The next slide, we see that the Romans came in waves, and when they came to destroy the city, they started north in the nation of Israel. They worked their way down. They were eliminating city by city, and then they came to Jerusalem, the crowning jewel. And there, the city was totally obliterated and destroyed, razed to the ground, and it was no more. Next slide. We go to the burning of the city. These are some artist renderings, and it was horrific. It was a beautiful place, one of the 7 wonders of the world, and now it's gone. And it is gone forever. Next slide. And we see the burning of the temple, and it was also destroyed. And one reason why the stones were not left upon another, all the gold and silver that was in the building and on the doors and all the artwork, it melted and went into the cracks of the rocks. And the Romans were digging, and they tore down the rocks. They turned them over to get all the gold and silver. That's one reason why not one stone was left upon another. We'll go to the next slide. We see that people that tried to escape, the land around there was forested there in Jerusalem, but it was deforested because the Romans made their battle works. They made their implements of war, the ramming rods. They cut down trees. They crucified people. Anyone that was able to escape out of the city, they caught, and they crucified them, and they had them facing the city, and it was hundreds of people that surrounded the city. It was a horrific thing what happened there that day in that 5.5 months of siege by the Romans. And the place was deforested. Eventually, under the revolt of Barkova, if I'm pronouncing him right, 75 years later, even the land was tilled up and salted, and it was called Palestine. Now, the word Palestine means the land of the Philistines, and that was a sharp stick in the eye to the Jew that it was now called Palestine, not the land of Judea. So horrific things were happening here. Let's go to the next slide. We have, as I mentioned, let's go back that one slide if we could. I didn't mention 1,100,000 died. Cruel deaths, whether starvation, crucifixion, the sword, what have you. The next slide shows us that they died by starvation and famine. And when you read the works of Josephus or the Roman historian Tacitus, they mention what happened here, and it was a horrific time. And the works of Josephus, the Jewish Wars, you can download his PDF and book, and you can read it, and it's horrific things that took place. The next slide, we see that this is the artist rendering. You'll notice a menorah, and the Jews, this is Titus. It's on the Arch of Titus, where he took 97,000 Jews as slaves. They carried them back to Rome. And then what they did, the next slide, they took the gold and silver from the temple, all the furnishings, all the instruments. They used that gold and silver to build the Colosseum that's today in Rome. That was Flavius, his father, Titus. They built this Colosseum, and it was built by the gold of the temple. And it was the very Colosseum that later a lot of Christians would die in. And so the gold was used and the silver was used to build this. Let's go to the next slide. So as a Jew, after the following things, what would I think? Well, now, as an Orthodox Jew who keeps the Passover and believes in the coming of the Messiah, what would I think of the following? What would I think? My faith, is it a lie? Is it useless? The reason, why would I think this? Well, in order for the Messiah to come, 7 prophecies must be fulfilled. And with the temple being gone, the city is gone, the people are gone, those 7 prophecies now cannot be fulfilled. And so if, as a Jew, looking at what's going on, I would ask myself that question. So what we're going to look at are those 7 prophecies that must come to pass. So number 1, the first, it's called the genealogical record. Now, when you read in the book of Matthew, you know, it's the begot chapter, you know, who begat who begat who. Now, you'll find that the begatting is within 14 generations of each other. And it's the confirmation of the lineal descent from Adam to Abraham, to David, to Christ. And this has to be proven because he has to come from the tribe of Judah. So that is one of the prophecies that had to be proven. And so the genealogical record, so the Messiah must be a proven descendant of the first man through Seth, Abraham, and David. Hence, a carefully kept genealogical table of the whole Testament period, fully 4,000 years, has been kept. Now, when this period ended, the proof of the lineal descent from David could be made from these tables, and no Jew now living could so be attested. So that's the first thing, that if I were a Jew, I would say, well, and if I knew the Scriptures, that according to the promise of Genesis 3:15, there must be a lineal descent, and we must say who begat who and prove that the Messiah was from the house of David, because that is the covenant. There were 7 covenants in the Bible that God made. He made the first covenant with Adam, and he violated the covenant. He died in that. He had perpetual life, but not eternal life. And when Adam sinned, that perpetual life now became death. And now by the redemption of God, we can have eternal life. And then the second covenant that was made was with Noah concerning the flood. The third covenant that God made was with Abraham, and that was the covenant of a royal people, of the circumcision, and the royal throne. The covenant that God made with David was upon the royal throne. And this is primarily dealing with that covenant that God made, and so there must be a lineal descent connecting to David. Now, would you not agree with that? That is one of the prophecies, and with the nation of Israel gone, today you cannot do that. You cannot do that, and it's impossible. And so the lineage has been destroyed. However, if I were a Jew standing at the edge of the city watching all of this, and this is going to bring us into our next teaching in the next hour, the appearing of Christ, what that means. But we see the next one now. Let's go to the next slide. Now, Christ's lineage must be confirmed by the 14 generations in Matthew. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations, and from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations, meaning this: 14 generations of the patriarchs, which are the prophets and the judges, the 14 generations under the kings, and then lastly the 14 generation of the princes and the priests. So in these different dispensational times concerning the house of Israel, where they were 14 generations, and that's why it says the 14 generations. The next slide. Now, it follows that the Old Testament Messiah either had already come or the inspiration of the Bible fails. So if I'm standing on the edge of the city and I'm watching my city burn, and I realize there must be this lineal descent, the proof of it, I say, well, it could only have been done before the burning of the city and the destruction of our nation. Therefore, I look back in time and I say, 30 some odd years ago, there was a man that was put on the cross. They called him the Messiah. Could he have been the Messiah? So I'd ask that question, because up until that point, he met the criteria that he was from the lineage of David. He was of the tribe of Judah. And so they called him the Messiah, and yet he was crucified. So we have that succession and a broken line from Adam to the Messiah, his birth, the continuity. He was the Jew, continued from King David in the perpetuity the promise of his coming fulfilled at the Jordan River. Behold, I come. And so at the Jordan River, when John baptized him and declared him, that was that end of that 14th generation. And here he is. There is a man that comes from the tribe of Judah. And now we're going to look at some other criteria concerning this man. So as a Jew, I would look back and I would say, is it possible that this man was indeed the Messiah? Well, let's go to the next slide. We see then, number 2, Jerusalem and Judea must continue without interruption unto the coming of the Messiah. Now, in the book of Genesis, what we find is a verse. We're going to see here in Genesis 49:10. So the scepter shall not depart from Judah. The Old Testament Messiah must come, and before Judah loses all national rule and authority and autonomy, for the prophecy of Jacob declares this. Now, this is what Jacob said in prophecy. He said, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come. Now, the word Shiloh means the coming of the Lord, the coming of the Messiah. So what he is saying, that Judah, the tribe of Judah, will remain in national prominence until, he must remain in national prominence until Shiloh come. That's why in Jerusalem, when Christ was here, Judah was the prominent nation. They were the prominent tribe. And they were in control there of Jerusalem. That's what was there. So it was the tribe of Judah. And so the scepter shall not depart from between his feet, meaning that Judah must remain in existence. Now, when I stand on the edge of the city and I see that the city is burned and everything is gone, I think of another prophecy that could have been fulfilled. This man at the Jordan River that was crucified later, he satisfies the record of the genealogy. And secondly, here we have that Judah was in national prominence when he was here. Now, if I'm a Jew and I'm thinking of this and I know the Bible, I know the prophets, I would say, well, now that my city is destroyed, everyone's carried off into captivity, Judah ceases to exist. Therefore, either the scriptures were true or I believe wrong. So here's another one, Numbers 24:17. I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab and destroy all the children of Seth. Let's go to the next slide. Now, David was from the tribe of Judah. Now, the throne of Israel would be to this tribe. The scriptures are clear that the scepter shall not depart from Judah. The tribe of Judah must be in existence when the Messiah comes. Judah must remain in national prominence. The Messiah would not establish this prophecy after the fall of Israel. It must be done before. Well, I realize that here's another prophecy that must be fulfilled. So he must have been the Messiah. Now, it's sad that a lot of us as Bible students don't know this. So what we're going to do fictitiously is create another Christ to come. And we're looking for this Antichrist, this man that's going to appear as the Messiah, and we're going to make a peace treaty with Israel. Well, I never read in the Bible a peace treaty with Israel. And I never read that, and I never read where there's a temple being built. And we'll go over that later. And but the temple is destroyed, and there's not one being built. Nowhere in the scriptures does it declare it. But this is what has been taught in the past concerning this, and I used to teach it, that there's going to be a temple built. It's called the Tribulation Temple. And Christ will return, and he will go into that temple, and he will destroy the Antichrist, and he will rule from that temple. That is false. Christ will not occupy a temple built with human hands. The Bible tells us that he will build it when he returns in the millennial reign. Now, let's go to the next slide. So the third thing is the glory of the latter house. Now, this is an important prophecy here. Now, you remember that Solomon built a temple. Well, it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And the nation was destroyed. The city was laid waste at that time. And when they went back after 70 years, and we dealt with this yesterday when we spake concerning the 70 weeks and the 70th week of Daniel, and how that the prophetic clock started when they went back and began to rebuild the city walls and the streets. Remember the three waves went back, and I think it was 456 AD. That's when the third wave went back, and that's when the walls and the streets were built. That began the 70-week time clock. Now, the second temple is built, and you remember the story when they were building the temple. The old men wept while the young men shouted because of the inferiority of the second temple compared to the former. Well, look what is mentioned here. The Old Testament Messiah must come while the second temple is standing. Now, for the prophetic compensation to those who sorrowed over its inferiority to Solomon's temple was that the glory of the latter house should exceed the glory of the former. How would that happen? Well, and the Messiah would come to that second temple and purify it. But that temple perished with Jerusalem, leaving not one stone upon another for nearly 2,000 years. There has been no temple. Therefore, either the Old Testament Messiah did come before the destruction of the temple, or inspirations have failed. The book of Haggai says this: the glory of this latter house shall be greater than the former, saith the Lord of hosts. And in this place will give peace, saith the Lord of hosts. Again, that the latter will be more glorious. You know why? Because Christ will enter it. That's why it would be more glorious. So in this third prophecy, if I were a Jew, I would realize, well, number one, there's no lineal descent now. We can't prove he come from the tribe of David. Number two, what was number two? I forgot what number two was. Go back one. Let me, okay, number two, okay, Jerusalem and Judea must be without interruption. All right, let's go to number three. We go back to number three, and number three is the glory of the latter house. So the temple must be standing. So if I'm a Jew, and we're talking about the coming of the Messiah, they say, well, there's going to be another temple built. I say, well, wait a minute. Number one, there's no lineal descent to prove the descent of Christ, the Messiah. Number two, Judah is gone. That's what the prophecy said, that the scepter shall not depart from between the feet of Judah until Shiloh come. And that's the Messiah. Number three, the glory of the latter house. The temple is gone, so you cannot fulfill messianic prophecy. You know, when you go to Jerusalem today, when we talk about the coming of the Messiah, when Christ comes, and they know this, he's coming and he will land upon the Mount of Olives. He's not coming to make a covenant and the Jews be duped by this. They know this. So you know this, and so we say, well, why are they so consumed? No, you're consumed with it. When I say you, I'm speaking generically, that in fundamentalism and in our Protestant or Baptist circles, people are talking about this Antichrist that's going to come. What about this? What do we do with these scriptures? So you know this is fallacy. And so things are not going to pan out as we have thought and have been taught. Let's go to the next slide. We see in the next slide here, the fourth thing, Rome must be in existence in order for the Messiah to come. Now, his kingdom established during the time of Rome. In the days of Daniel's fourth empire, the God of heaven himself, not by agent, but personally as the Messiah, was to set up a perpetual kingdom on earth. But Daniel's fourth empire passed away years ago, and through it took Rome 700 years to die. It's dead. A Messiah, therefore, who came not in the time of Rome's supremacy is no Old Testament Messiah. So Rome must be in existence. Now, if therefore he has not come already, the Old Testament inspiration has failed. So look what he says. In the days of the Roman Empire, now the kingdom of Christ was to be set up, Christ's kingdom, which is contained within the New Testament church at that appointed time. Daniel 2:44 is a familiar passage, and notice what it says. It says this: and in the days of these kings, when you look at the image, and I didn't have time to go over the image, but Babylon is the head of gold, Persia is silver, brass of the Greeks, the iron is Rome, and then you have the 10 toes of iron and clay. But he said, in the days of these kings, in that succession of nations it fell, and with Rome, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Let's go to the next slide. And we see in Daniel 4:3 how great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. Isaiah 9:6-7, for unto us a child is born, a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. That's the millennial reign. And his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end. Upon the throne of David, that's that lineal descent, and upon his kingdom to order it and to establish it with judgment and justice from henceforth even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. Luke 1:33, and he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. Let's go to the next slide. Before we do, let's go to Luke chapter 22, 29 and 30 in our Bibles, all right? Luke chapter 22, 29 and 30. Now, this is in regard to the kingdom. Now, every kingdom has laws and ordinances. Now, if you have a kingdom, you have to have laws, you have to have ordinances, you have to have subjects, you have to have a dominion, you have to have a purpose, you have power. Notice what he says here in Luke chapter 22, verse 28. Here he has established the Lord's Supper. He's in the upper room. And he says in verse 28, he said here in Luke chapter 22, he said, "Ye are they which have continued with me in my temptations. And I appoint unto you a" what? A kingdom. "As my Father hath appointed unto me, that ye may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom." So in essence, when we're having the Lord's Supper in a biblical context, we're having the Lord's Supper within his kingdom. So the New Testament church is an embassy. It's an aggregate. This church is not the totality of the kingdom. It is part of it. And it's like an embassy, and these embassies are scattered around the country and around the world. There's one up in Marquette area called Shiloh. There's one here. And so you have laws and ordinances, and churches can die, but the kingdom never can. This church can die, but the kingdom will not. Churches could go apostate, but the kingdom cannot. And he said, "I appoint unto you a kingdom." So when the kingdom was set up in the days of the Roman Empire, when the Greek Empire fell, the last remaining part of that empire was Egypt under Cleopatra. She was of the Ptolemy dynasty. Now, when Alexander, he had no posterity, no children, so his kingdom, the Greek Empire, was divided into four generals. You have Ptolemy, which that was the Egyptian era, Egypt. Then you had Seleucid, that was Syria. And that's where Antiochus came from. There, when you read in Daniel, I think, chapter 9, the desecration of the temple, a lot of folks mistake him for being the Antichrist, but Antiochus, he was of the Seleucid dynasty. And then, of course, he died. You'll see his death in Daniel chapter 11. And that was history. That is not future. And then you have Cassander, and then you have Lysimus, these other two generals that dominated the Greek Empire. Well, they all fell, and the last remaining one that fell was Cleopatra. That was with Mark Antony in the battle that they had where they tried to overthrow Rome. And Caesar Augustus now, at the victory of that battle, he became the undisputed ruler of the world. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. In the days of Caesar Augustus, Christ was born. And then it was in the days of Tiberius, Emperor Tiberius, that John the Baptist was now preaching in the Jordan River, baptizing, and that's when he was now is the administrator of the door into the New Testament church, and the kingdom was set up, and Christ had that kingdom. And then when he was going to die, he said, "I appoint this unto you." And so the church now has become the executorship of his kingdom, which contains of laws and ordinances, power, subjects, and dominion, and so forth. So the kingdom had to be set up, and this is not the revision of the Roman Empire. Now, the kingdom that's set up now will be in its fullness when we're gathered together with Christ, because now Christ is preparing a people to rule and reign with him. And if we are worthy to rule and reign with him, we then will be appointed that crown and the inheritance to rule and reign with him, and be delegated our positions to rule with him in the regeneration or in the messianic reign. But right now the kingdom was set up in the days of the Roman Empire. Now the Roman Empire is gone, and it ceases to exist. And some say, well, that was going to be a revision of the Roman Empire. Well, may you show me the chapter and verse that's going to happen. Well, let's go to the next slide. Number 6. A shadow of better things to come. Institutions must be in place to remain until the Messiah comes, such as the shadow of better things to come, Christ being cut off yet again. The whole Old Testament economy was confessedly by a shadow of better things to come. All its institutions and types, rituals were appointed to stand until the substance came. Other words, the showbread, Christ is the showbread. You have your 7 feasts in the Bible. Passover, I believe in Leviticus chapter 21, I think it is. You have Passover. He is our Passover lamb. You have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's Christ's body, the sinless unleavened bread. That's the burial. You have the Feast of First Fruits. That's Christ. He is the resurrected one. Then you have the Feast of Pentecost. That was the empowering, the baptism of the Spirit upon the New Testament church as an institution. Then you'll have 6 months later, you have the Feast of Trumpets. That's the call to repentance. Then you have the Feast of Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. That's when the high priest once a year goes into the temple. That was fulfilled by Christ Jesus, when not by the blood of goats and bulls, but by his own blood went he once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. Then we have the Feast of Tabernacles. That's the millennial reign that he's referring to, and they occupied the land. They lived in booths and tents, and then the expansion of the kingdom. So that is referring to the feast during the millennial reign, and that's the feast that will be conducted when they come to Jerusalem once a year. Is the Feast of Tabernacles, celebrating the occupation of the land. Now, so these things are a shadow of things to come. So they had to be in continuation, and it's not been a continuation. The Jews have not had a priest, an ephod, an altar, a temple, or none of that. And so the only time this could be fulfilled is before these things ended. Let's go to the next slide, number 7. Now, the temple feast in the Old Testament economy must be in place. In Hebrews 10:1, it says, "For the law, having a shadow of good things to come and not the very image of the thing, can never, with those sacrifices which they offered year by year, continually make the comers thereunto perfect." Hebrews 10, verse 9. "Then said he," the prophecy of Psalm 40, "I come to do thy will, O God. He taketh away the first," which is the first Old Testament. That he took it away. So it had to remain, but he takes it away. So if I'm a Jew, no lineal descent, no temple, no Judah, no temple, and all these things are gone, the shadows, these sacrifices are gone, I'm thinking they had to be in place. Could it be that man that was crucified 30 some odd years before the destruction of my city, could he have been the Messiah? Well, the sacrifice of the offering of the body of Jesus Christ. So that's when he came. That's when God gave his son there at the Jordan River. "Behold, I come to do thy will, O God." He was born, Isaiah 6:9. He came. That's when God so loved the world, he gave his son. That's when he gave him there at the Jordan River is the Lamb of God. There's the witness that John refers to. He came not by water only, but by water and blood. And the Spirit that anointed him bear witness. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the 7th is the Messiah has come as the sacrifice. Now, since we know that at this time no sacrifice for sins or smoke upon any Jewish altar, or all of its prophetic oracles are dumb, and since the types have perished at the precise time appointed, if no Messiah has come as the great sacrifice, then the Old Testament scriptures have failed. These institutions must have been in place not to reappear. Finally, the Old Testament predicts repeatedly that with great precision that the chosen people would be rejected, their temple would be destroyed, their city trampled underfoot, and other nations, themselves dispersed among all nations, though not destroyed, abiding many days without a king, without a prince, without a sacrifice, without a pillar, without an ephod, or a priest, or a prophet, yet preserved in continual persecution as a distinct people. And this calamity, because they would reject their Messiah coming at the time and in the manner designated by their prophets, and that this state of dispersion and persecution should last until they accepted the Messiah that they have rejected. Now, this will be applied to the remnant. Let's go to the next slide. Now, so, if I were a Jew, what would I think? If you were a Jew and you knew these things, and you're back in 70 AD, what would you realize? What would you think? So that if these particulars have failed, or any one of them, or if in the 2,000 years since this great calamity came upon their nation, if it can be established by historical proof that they have returned to their land, restored their government, rebuilt their temple, reinstituted their priesthood, and its sacrifices in it have not accepted the Messiah which they rejected 2,000 years ago, then Old Testament inspiration has failed. Why? These 7 things must be in place before the Messiah comes. So even if the Jews go back, rebuild their city, rebuild the temple, get an altar, have a priest, have the ephod, have the sacrifices, we look at it and say, it is null and void. It means nothing. Because it had to all be done before the city was destroyed. Now, if I know that, Jews knew that. Now, what we're doing because of lack of knowledge, we are fabricating. We're taking what happened then, pulling it up by the roots, and putting it all into the future. And trying to establish this again in Daniel 9, instead of making where it's the Messiah making the covenant, now we say it's the Antichrist making a peace treaty with Israel. That's a fabrication, and it's a lie. It's not in the Bible. Hebrews 9:26 says, "For then must he often have suffered, since the foundation of the world, but now, once in the end of the world, the age, hath he appeared to put away sin, the sacrifice of himself, making an end of sins." Remember the 6 points? "And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment. So Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation." And this is when he appears at the Mount of Olives. And we'll see that in the next hour. But let's go to the next slide if there is one. Now, if I were a Jew, what would I think? I would realize that Christ was the Messiah, or my faith is false. John 8:28, "Then said Jesus unto them, When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then shall ye know that I am he." Now, that is a key phrase. What did he mean by that? When they lift up the Son of Man, then they're going to know that he is he, and that I do nothing of myself, but my Father hath taught me. I speak these things, and he that sent me is with me. The Father hath not left me alone, for I do always those things which please him. As he spake of these words, many believe. So remember this, when I'm lifted up, I'm going to cover this in the next hour. Then you will know. That deals with the appearing of the Son of Man. Then you will know. The Jews will realize their city burns and they are destroyed as a nation, that either that the scriptures have failed or that Christ indeed was the Messiah. So they're going to know he's the Messiah because of all the destruction. That's how they're going to know. So go to the next slide. If there is one, there isn't. Okay. Any questions? Yes, Randy. Yes, the second 3.5 years is the baptism of fire. It's the desolation, which means destruction. And what we'll see next is how that the Roman armies are connected to that desolation. They surround, they'll compass Jerusalem, and they're desolated, they're desolate. And that is the second half of that 70th week of that tribulation that was to the nation of Israel for their rejection of the Messiah. So when he's lifted up, and then he's there, he's lifted up. And so let's go up forward in time in 70 A.D. There's going to be people that remember him being lifted up. They've seen him, and he was the Messiah. Now all this is destroyed, and I know the Bible. I know these 7 prophecies, and I go, he was the Messiah. Because there's no way a Messiah could come now. He cannot come. No Messiah can come. If I'm a Jew, and they're saying, oh, there's a new Messiah, or there's going to make a peace treaty with Israel. If you know the Bible as a Jew, you know the prophets, that ain't true. There's no Messiah coming, except when every eye shall see him. When he steps foot upon the Mount of Olives, and he comes back to rule the nations. That's in Matthew chapter 25. That's after chapter 24. That's when he comes and separates the goat nations from the sheep nations, and there he sets up his judgment, and that's when the Messianic reign begins. He begins building his tabernacle, the tabernacle of David there, and that's where he will rule from. And then the 12 thrones of Israel, the 12 tribes upon which the apostles sit, under that will be the jurisdictional governments of the world, which we will serve under as well, because he hath made us kings and priests. So we'll be within that. I'm not sure what tribe we'll be allocated to, but we will rule and reign with Christ 1,000 years. We're grafted into them, not them into us. We got to remember that. So this is a Jewish institution as far as the Jewish as Abraham is concerned, of faith, not ethnicity, but it's the faith of Abraham, because Abraham had these promises before he was even circumcised. So it isn't ethnicity, and that's what makes the circumcision and in the ethnicity of that covenant is what identified him as the Jewish people. But Abraham had the justification of faith by this, and God made this covenant with him before he was circumcised, before a Jew existed. But it was through his lineage that would come the Messiah. That's why we have this, the Jewish race. So, any other questions? Okay, Brother Cameron, we did pretty good. We buttoned this up at 1/4 till. So, amen. If no other questions, we'll go ahead and take a break then and come back at the top of the hour? Okay.